Hello and welcome back to Podcast with a K. I'm your host Carla with a K, and it is just me in the studio tonight, but we are live. You're listening to WECS 90.1 FM or twitch.tv/CarlyGirl or wherever you get your podcasts. That was a German song called Zukunft Pink by Peter Fox featuring Inez. And I did look up the translated lyrics because not only is it a banger and not only does it have a great music video, but it also happens to be about basically the future is pink. Girls run the world. Um, and of course, I'm always here for a dig at our evil overlord, Elon Musk. Anyway, I hope you've had a fantastic weekend and that the rest of your week is looking up. I have had a couple of topics in mind that I wanted to talk about on the podcast, and I finally got the perfect way to segue into these conversations. Namely, firstly, I kind of want to talk about something that we've addressed before, being cancel culture, but not in the way you think. I'm not going to sit here and talk about is cancel culture toxic? I want to talk about it in a specific, very specific format. And the reason being that I came across something that I didn't know about a certain thing that I was accidentally already against. But I digress. I want you to have this conversation with me naturally, so rather than tell you stay tuned for insert topic here, I think I will just simply have the conversation as it developed in my mind. So, let's begin, shall we? Basically, we start this train of thought with Saturday Night Live's 50th anniversary. This weekend, they've been doing a whole bunch of events, a whole bunch of different broadcasts. There was a concert. They re-aired the first ever episode, and they had a 3-hour special on last night. And first of all, I've never been happier to have moved the podcast away from Sundays because ratings be what they are, even on a Monday night. I feel like there's no way the podcast can compete with a Sunday slot right at the same time as SNL, which I know, Saturday Night Live on a Sunday, crazy. It still fits the acronym, and that's what matters. But in any case, 50 years of SNL, I'm a fan. I started watching SNL around the time that Seth Meyers was doing Weekend Update. My favorite host to date. I don't know, man. Something about his, well, my favorite standalone update anchor, I'll say. Something about his demeanor, something about his jokes, his delivery. I've just always really resonated with it. Although, don't get me wrong, I love, 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 love Colin Jost and Michael Che. It's been a long time. I think 11 years, which feels insane because I'm like, oh yeah, the new hosts. And I'm like, it's not new anymore. It's been a decade. But in any case, I feel like in my circle, people either love or hate SNL. It's very rare for someone in my circle to be indifferent to SNL. And that's because I tend to hang out with pretty opinionated people in the first place. But because um, political opinion and comedic opinion tend to kind of intercede there, right? And of course, you have people who love SNL because it's witty, because it's funny, because it really tells it like it is. And there's people that hate it because they think it's too political, because they think the jokes fall flat, or because they think that the views on SNL are very one-sided. But I don't know. None of that really matters to me. It's a comedy show. They're going to make the jokes that they want to make, and I'm here to laugh at them anyway, right? That's the whole point. And I think that's kind of the important thing to note about SNL. It sets the bar, right? It's a network television show. It's written by a bunch of people and then it's verified by a whole bunch more. They can't say anything too crazy. They can't say anything too vulgar. They can't say anything too daring because it's all on network television, right? It has to be approved. And if they fall outside of certain parameters, they get slapped with a huge fine. And, you've seen this in the past whenever somebody swears on TV. That's, I believe, a $250,000 FCC fine, which is pocket change for them, I'm sure. But still not a fine that anyone really wants to be paying, right? That's budget money. um, but I feel like the thing about a show like SNL, like people like to judge it like pretty harshly and critique it pretty directly. But SNL is any network show, as any network comedy, is your base point for comedy, right? Like you can't expect to be successful in comedy and be worse than SNL. You know what I'm saying? Like it's not that the bar is on the ground and SNL is the worst of the worst. That's simply just the price to beat, you know? Like that's kind of the mark that you have to meet and that's it. If you're not doing better than that, then you're not doing better than that. And that's because generally speaking, mainstream media and network television is what kind of sets that tone for what's acceptable. Um, because of that, I found it very funny that SNL decided to feature essentially any potential controversy that anyone could have picked out before or during the show, right? Before anyone could go back and be like SNL did this, cancel them. And in general, with the topic of cancel culture, I think it's so interesting that a show like SNL kind of gets a pass a lot of the time because, you know, I feel like it's easy to be like, oh, well, it's SNL, it's been on for so long, it's just kind of there. Or, there's the other side that's like, who even cares about SNL? Who watches that? And, that's something that SNL themselves made fun of. They have a segment called Black Jeopardy in which they feature um either their black cast members or black guests. And one of the well, this for this reunion they had Leslie Jones, they had Tracy Morgan, and they had Eddie Murphy. And one of the jokes that they had was, you know, what is SNL? And they're like, no one watches that. Who knows what that is? And they're talking about In Living Color. They're talking about like any and every other variety show that's not SNL, and like that's what they know. And I find that funny because it's kind of true. Like most network television, it's tailored to a very specific audience, right? It's like the most sanitized form of comedy possible, which again is why I found it very funny that they went ahead and decided to kind of out themselves on everything they've ever done. For me, it's also additionally interesting because it's what Jenna Marbles did, right? Jenna Marbles was a huge YouTuber who, grew up with like the whole era of YouTube being from like say 2010 to 2020. And she, during the time in which everyone, for whatever reason, decided their favorite pastime or their favorite hobby would be to dig up old videos and kind of hate brigade every creator for something that they'd said 10 years ago, for a joke that they'd made 10 years ago, Jenna Marbles decided to go ahead and essentially cancel herself. She got like one or two comments that got a lot of attention, and she made her apology video saying that she never wanted to hurt anyone. She made jokes that she thought were funny at the time, and she's changed and she's seen the impact of her word and the size of her following. And to be fair, she had always on purpose stayed out of any social commentary outside of any political commentary, saying that it wasn't really her place to tell anyone how to think, especially since she had such a big following. The only thing she ever publicly advocated for being um, against actually animal cruelty and for vegan lifestyles, right? And so in her video where she cancels herself, she brings up every instance of problematic things that she'd done in the past. She took down all her videos. She said she didn't care. She didn't care if they were funny. She didn't care if it was in the past. Like she didn't want people to defend her either, because basically at the core of it all, if only one person was offended by something she had said or she had done, it was over, it was enough, and she didn't want that out there, right? And then she came back like once just with her boyfriend, who kind of took over their internet persona just to say like she was fine, she was doing okay now, but she had made the right choice, right? And so it's funny to see the difference between a YouTuber doing that and, again, and like one of the biggest network television shows in the last 5 decades do that. And so SNL had Tom Hanks come on the camera and introduce an in memoriam of characters gone too soon In other words, all of the problematic segments that they'd ever done across 50 years. And in order, or in no particular order, from best to worst or most to least offensive, I think this is just an order of appearance. Um, they had clips of racial and ethnic stereotypes, sexual harassment, pedophilia, animal cruelty, body shaming, slut shaming, homophobia, ableism, sexism, slurs, even blackface. And, like these skits have people of and actors of every possible background, right? And it's for the joke. And I find it so interesting that, of course, it's a very smart move, right? Like their entire angle seemed to be to get ahead of any possible controversy. But I think in the opening like intro for that segment, Tom Hanks says, like we made those jokes, but you laughed at them, so should it not be you getting canceled, the audience? And that was, I think, one of the funniest power moves, but also like the corniest power moves I've seen in anything ever. But I thought it was such a crazy decision because even just watching the clips of that in today's day and age, right? Like a lot of those jokes don't fly anymore because people are afraid of offending the wrong person with a huge amount of power and, getting either fined or getting the show taken off the air. And I think SNL is kind of bulletproof in that way, which is, again, after 50 years and all the connections that they have and the fact that it's a huge, huge, huge moneymaker. Like, SNL's fine, right? SNL's safe. But apart from that, they also made mention, which is the one that I thought was interesting, they made mention to any problematic guests, whether on the air currently or in previous things. So, of course, they mentioned OJ, they mentioned Kanye, and even alluded to having a Kanye performance, but then obviously he didn't, he was not featured. Which I'm like, dang, no way they teased that. That's crazy. That's crazy talk, especially if you aren't aware, other than Kanye West simply deciding to be a public figure for like the alt-right movement. He went on a crazy crazy outright anti-Semitic rant on Twitter over the last week or so before the Super Bowl, peaking with selling shirts with swastikas on them and calling out people by name and just awful 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 stuff, enough that it got his account restricted on Twitter. But apart from like those types of situations which are like pretty big and like in the news, right? From OJ to Kanye, they also highlighted Ryan Reynolds being in the audience, and they ask him, hey, how are you? How you doing? He's like, good. Why? What have you heard? Or something along those lines. And Ryan Reynolds, of course, being involved right now in a weird lawsuit in which it's unclear about whether him and his wife were trying to lie to get a different actor canceled via lawsuit, really public lawsuit. So I thought it was such an interesting choice to go through and not mention, of course, like all of their clips, but all of the people in their audience that were controversial and previous actors and previous guests. Of course, they had to make reference to Chevy Chase, among a list of just anyone and everyone. But the one thing that they didn't mention was Donald Trump. And I thought that was such an interesting decision, but I also think it was a really smart decision. And I was talking about this with a friend yesterday, and the kind of consensus that we reached was that it is probably the best decision they could have made, because that way it doesn't take away from the rest of the special, right? It doesn't create like any weird air of resentment, any hyperfixation or hyperfocus on it, because at the end of the day, SNL isn't exactly about, or exclusively, I suppose, about politics or about any one person. And I feel like having featured that, even in their segment of controversial guests, I think would have taken away a lot of the attention. And it would have also drawn attention from anyone that was kind of like waiting on it so that they could jump on SNL and be like, see, SNL is always one-sided, they're always attacking. Or for the other side to be like, how dare they feature someone who's so awful and, tyrannical. And I think it was just honestly the smartest thing. It was such an unexpected move, and at first I was like, they really didn't say anything? But by the end of it, I was like, nah, I see it. I get it. And I think that's for the best because the focus was on the comedy. And there's a segment as well, like towards the end, where, it's the Five Timers Club and Jimmy Fallon is there. And I think Drew Barrymore and AO and the character of Debbie Downer and Robert De Niro shows up, right? And so Debbie Downer's doing her Debbie Downer thing, and Robert De Niro goes and he like puts his hands like around her like as if to strangle her. He's like, "Listen," he says something like, "I'm here to have fun and to be distracted for just 3 hours of my day. I don't want to think about anything. I don't want to worry about anything. I just want to laugh." And so I was like, that is so on the nose, but also like self-reflective, I think, of SNL. Like, I feel like the writers as well as the network have kind of taken a step back because the same way that, for example, everyone got swept up in this kind of trend of being politically performative, you know, you have to perform, of course, to what's gonna trend. You have to do what's gonna make money. But I think in that, a lot of people kind of lose themselves into this false interest, maybe. And if it's not a false interest, it's easy to get very wrapped up into all of it and kind of forget that there's more out there, there's more to comment on, there's more things to do. And I remember there's an episode of The Middle that I really like, in which, speaking just of network comedies, The Middle being, I don't remember when it went off the air, but The Middle was just like this like family sitcom. It's this like poorish family in Indiana, and the entire premise of the show is just like of the parents raising the kids and like how the kids go through life and they always get into crazy hijinks every week, the typical format. But somewhere on like the seventh season or so, the daughter Sue goes to college, and she's like kind of just this like head in the clouds like nerdy type of girl, like obsessed with like romance. The brother's like a jock and the younger brother is like this like weird little kid who also has autism. And so like the show is just kind of a very like overarching look at like this is what a family, like an average family, could look like, but it's never like about anything related to any of it, right? Like it focuses mostly on like the stereotype of like the cool half of the family and like the weird half of the family and just how they go through life and like try to make it out there. And so when Sue goes to college, she gets involved in like all of these clubs and into all of these like causes, and she like learns that there's more to the world than just like what she's known in like small town Indiana, right? And so she like the family's like visiting and they're all like trying to have a good time, and she's kind of the Debbie Downer character, and she keeps bringing up like everything that's wrong with the world. And the mom's like, I just miss my little happy Sue, or I want her back. And Sue goes, I'm outraged that you think my outrage is a phase. And so the episode goes on, and she's like, I can't believe you don't care about anything. I don't want to be like you. And then blah, 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 blah. And then towards the end, she's like, I'm sorry we fought, Sue, to the mom. She's like, I'm sorry we fought, but you have to understand, I care very deeply about things. I care about women's rights, and I care about poverty, and I care about high fructose corn syrup. And there are so many things to care about, and I don't know if I can care about them all. And sometimes I don't even know which way to care. Because some people say the sonar the military sends out messes up the dolphins and the whales, but other people say that the sonar protects the borders. And I love whales and borders. And I don't even know why I bother caring at all. And so the mom's like, you will always care about the right amount because that's you. And so that episode I always really liked because, it's true. Like when you learn that there are things to care about, you want to care about everything. But it's very much like the type of thing where you have to learn, not necessarily even to like choose your battles, but, there's only so much one person can do. And you can care about a lot of things without letting them consume you. And I feel like that's kind of where I sit on the conversation about cancel culture because, I don't know, as someone who thinks that you should be nice to other people, right? And that other people deserve rights and respect. I don't think that cancel culture is a phrase that I ever really sat peacefully with, but I think the important thing is, of course, a very rare thing nowadays, which is critical thinking, right? You have to look at a thing and be like, does this matter? Are there people that are dying? Okay. And those are like your two, I think, scales, right? And this goes for like a million and one things. Because, of course, at the very least, as far as comedy goes, right? Like, it's possible to make a joke that is directed at somebody or at something. But if it's going to be offensive, it has to be funny, right? You can't just laugh while you call someone a slur and call it a joke, right? If there's no nuance, then there's no point. And so I think that as far as I'm concerned, like that's kind of where it is, right? Like there's some comedians that I absolutely cannot stand because like any joke that they make is just for the sake of like trying to get under somebody's skin. And it might be funny the first time, it might be funny the second time, but like eventually it gets stale, right? Like for example, I think the ventriloquist Jeff Dunham, I can't stand him. He's not funny. And it's not that his jokes don't land, it's that so many of his jokes are just for the sake of being annoying. And it's like that kid in your class that thinks it's funny, like to throw a spitball, right? It's funny the first time and it's funny the second time, but eventually it's like, dude, do something new, do something interesting, right? And so pivoting back to like um back to SNL, even with Weekend Update, right? Colin Jost, Michael Che, Colin Jost being white and Michael Che being black. Whenever the season ends, they always do a joke swap. And so they write jokes for each other to say with the purpose of being offensive, but they're still funny. And they're the segments that do the best of any, like the whole year. If you go back and you look at like the trending stuff, like of course there's some stuff that's trendy with just like what's topical or because of the guest, right? But as far as like the Weekend Update jokes go, which tend to be more so again social and political commentary, right? Like that's kind of where that ends. Because it's objectively funny. And that's where you get like all of those comments that are like, see, this is what it was like whenever people weren't afraid to do jokes. And it's like, no, those people are still doing jokes. It's just that you have to give them the same platform that you're giving to all of these really annoying, like boring comedians. Because that's what it comes down to. So, all in all, that's kind of how like comedy evolves as well. And I'm seeing Abby in the chat says that's how she feels with some SNL skits. They're not as funny as people think they are. Like Debbie Downer is not funny to her. And Debbie Downer is kind of a classic character, right? And I think that's kind of the point of Debbie Downer. Like, whenever I personally sit here and I look at like recaps or I look at old episodes, like the Debbie Downer segment to me, like, I don't want to watch it. It sucks. I hate it. But that's the joke in that, like, there are people that are, genuinely like that. And so that's kind of why I like the end of the Debbie Downer segment with Robert De Niro. I think they don't do it every time, but every now and then, like, someone gets annoyed with her, and it's not always Robert De Niro trying to strangle her, right? But it's just someone being like, "Please calm down. I just want to laugh." But at the end of the day, there's more to life than the troubles, I guess. And so it's important to live your life in a way that is productive. And it's important to care about things, but not enough that you forget to live your life. So, with that being said, a beautiful segue to our midpoint song, which is Me Olvide de Vivir by Julio Iglesias, which translates to I Forgot to Live, which is really just a really pretty old song that I was reminded about through a playlist that somebody had sent me. Um, and it's in my head, so it is now our halfway song. And again, I did a beautiful segue. I will pat my own self on the back for it. So here you go, that. Okay, that was Me Olvidé de Vivir by Julio Iglesias. So, like I was saying, even when I was looking up the quote from the middle, people were like, why was this show allowed to air when it glorifies a bad family? And, like, the parents are inept. Like, there's no reason a family with 3 kids should be poor. And the mom doesn't clean the house and she doesn't get them vacations and she throws tantrums and the dad is just emotionally absent. Like, tearing the show apart, sure, like at its roots. But I was like, of all of the TV shows, I feel like it's the most realistic one. Like, it's the most average family doing the most average things. That's the whole point of the show. And, it went on for like almost, what, 10 seasons or something. And so for a show to have gone on for that long, obviously it has to have been good enough. And it's funny to see, like, all of these comments, of course, are from like more recent years now that the show's been off air. And it's kind of just a sign of the times how, like, I don't know, the general perspective changes. And also I think it's just interesting because it shows that the perspective of the audience can also be skewed, because one of the comments that I saw, it was like, this reminds me of my parents who I don't talk to anymore and they wonder why I don't talk to them as an adult and blah 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 blah. And I'm like, oh, so you're projecting, right? And I think that's a lot of the reason that um people like kind of feed into cancel culture. You see in the things that you hate, you see other people and other things that you have a problem with. And so I think it's easy to kind of, instead of addressing those issues with the people like at your reach, you see these types of people do that with someone outside of their reach, right? Someone who may or may not ever see that comment, which is why the phrase that I used is that, like, it became trendy to be politically performative. And even so, I think what's more important is putting your money where your mouth is, because money is power and power is what gets you a platform, right? And so even here, I talk a lot about like separating the artist from the art. And you've seen in real time my position change about someone like Kanye, right? Where at first it was like, I mean, he's kind of weird now, but the bangers are still bangers. And then he starts saying a little bit more weird stuff. He, shows up as the right hand man to Trump, and it's like, well, it's a little bit personal now, but you know what? Sometimes people have different political opinions. He's just rich and famous and detached from reality. And now, even, a month ago, I was listening to a playlist on stream and it featured a lot of like Kanye features. And we talked about this then too, but I don't think I could in good faith ever do anything associated with a Kanye song again, right? Like, not just because I'm like, oh man, it's appalling because he's weird and gross and anti-Semitic. Obviously, yes, I care about that, but the main thing is, even if it's 0.00003 cents that he's getting from my Spotify streams, I'm like, I don't want to give him the money to live a grand life on my dollar while he's being an idiot, while I'm sitting here making no money and having to listen to him being an idiot, living a life off of my dollar, right? And basically, the way that I see it is like, boycotting an artist or boycotting a cause, or, you know, sending a tweet off, right? Posting something on your Instagram story. It raises awareness, but it really doesn't do any service to anybody if there's not a result, right? And so it's like, sure, like, not listening to an artist keeps that money from going into their pocket, right? Not going to a store keeps that money from going to that store. And at the core of it, like, by something getting results, I don't mean like, I don't mean people trying to set the Capitol building on fire. I don't mean people pulling a Luigi. I just mean taking away that megaphone from someone who is so obviously misusing it, like Kanye, right? Or, the trio of losers that are pulling the strings on our puppet of a government. And I think there's a divide between performative activism, between cancel culture, and between simply just not supporting something you don't agree with, right? Like, whenever it comes down to like how you're using your money, I think it's unfortunate because I've said this phrase on the show before, like, there's no ethical consumerism in a capitalist society, and that's just the sad truth. But if I have to choose between, like, for example, like, if we're talking about money straight up in like stores and, you know, who's involved with what, right? Like, if I have to choose an anecdote from my own personal life, right? I'm an artist. I like to buy art supplies. I would rather give my money to a company like Michaels, whose biggest problem is that they overcharge for art supplies, than someone like Hobby Lobby, who is homophobic and also smugglers. Which brings me to what I wanted to talk about today on the show as well, in that, the old scandal is, of course, that there was a huge case with Hobby Lobby that allowed them to claim religious liberty for the sake of their hiring practices and not to have to hire people of alternative genders or sexualities because, the owners are Christian, right? And that's old news. That's obviously bad. Hobby Lobby bad. Michael's good. Sure. Whatever. Right? But I was recently made aware of an entirely different scandal that I had no knowledge of. And it makes me so happy that my money was not used for these purposes. By which I mean that Hobby Lobby got caught smuggling Iraqi antiquities for an enormous new Bible museum and essentially stole over 5,000 artifacts and imported them illegally as samples, which is a crazy sentence. So, let me just go down this rabbit hole with you guys, because this is the rabbit hole that has consumed my previous week. I found one article, and one article led to another article, which eventually led me to the Wikipedia, and this is just kind of where I sunk my time. So, let's go through this together, right? So you can be brushed up to speed. You can look this up yourself. You literally just have to type Hobby Lobby smuggling scandal. If you look it up, you're eventually going to read what I'm going to read to you right now. But this basically all started in 2009 when representatives of the Hobby Lobby chain received a large number of clay bullae, which is inscribed clay, and tablets, which came from the ancient Near East, which the Near East is the region that spanned across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Iran, Anatolia, the Armenian highlands, Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula. And so this was meant for the Museum of the Bible, which is a museum in DC that operates as a nonprofit organization by the Green family, who are evangelical Christians. Their defense was that these items were never featured in the Museum of the Bible, but that, again, is because they were caught and they were forced, of course, to forfeit and return this. The problem is that these items were not only illegally sourced, as in they were, the way that they were attained was through looting. They were also being transported without being put on any form of record, right? And so this was seized by U.S. Customs in 2011, which sparked a struggle for the items and for the money between Hobby Lobby and the federal government, which ended up with Hobby Lobby having to forfeit everything in 2017. The artifacts and the value of this was $3 million. So all of this was worth $3 million. They originally seized 3,800 items from Hobby Lobby in 2018. And by 2020, Hobby Lobby president Steve Green had agreed to return 11,500 items to Egypt and Iraq, which, again, is an insane sentence. Hobby Lobby is an art supply store. Why are they smuggling stolen goods? And so, not even are they the ones smuggling stolen goods, they were the ones that were intending to to have these displayed in the Museum of the Bible. And so the problem is that where they originally got all of these items is from an ancient city called, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, I might butcher this, not to sound like, a first grade teacher learning everyone's names, but I believe this is pronounced Iziragrig. and that's the most like Americanized version of that as I can muster, which is essentially like a lost city in Iraq where it's not like a clear location. Like it's an open area, but it's like super 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 rich with like historical artifacts. And although it's not um been fully like researched and excavated, looters like to go here and just grab anything, because since none of it's written like as anything that it is, because again it's just like this small little like lost city, the artifacts, essentially people, looters, will just go and grab them and then sell them to the highest bidder, which is what Hobby Lobby did. They purchased it from dealers in the United Arab Emirates, and since there's no like history of ownership, they just kind of undergo the same path as anything black market, right? Like they're just like, hey, you want a sick item? Sick. Don't tell nobody, right? And so the problem is that apart from just those looted items, there were also items that came from the National Museum of Iraq, which was unfortunately a new hub for looting after the American invasion in 2003. So, all in all, like this region that is so rich with so much culture and so much history became kind of like an open battleground for anyone that wanted these historical items and anyone that wanted to sell or buy or trade, since there's not any record, there's not any documentation for them, whether it's through the fact that those areas just simply haven't been excavated, those archaeological sites are still in process, or because of course tearing a country down with war makes it so that there are other priorities than protecting a museum. um Again, I feel like the connection between Hobby Lobby to this is insane. And the amount of things that were trafficked, the value of the things that were trafficked is insane, right? And in short, right? Like the reason that it's important is because there's the reason that this is important to me is because like there's such a crazy involvement in this one company, right? That has already undergone so much fire, only to find out that there's like that the whole case um with the religious freedom suit that they tried to file, right? Or the religious liberty, sorry, is like the tip of the iceberg. Like the more that you look in, the more that like Hobby Lobby's team, I guess, right? Like their execs, like their board, and their actions are just like increasingly concerning and problematic, until you reach this point where you find out that they've been smuggling stolen, looted historical artifacts, right? I think that's one of the craziest things I've ever heard of. It's one of the craziest things that I've ever found out. And I'm just so happy. I'm so happy that I'm Michael's girly, right? Like, again, it's really hard to shop ethically when everything is bad and the world is dying. But at the very least, my money was never used in order to loot Iraq, at least not in this way. I'm just so absolutely appalled. I'm so shocked. And whenever I read this at first, I was like, this is an Onion article, right? There's no way this isn't an article from the Onion. But it's completely true. It's completely factual. And from from the whole timeline, right, of events, the fact that Hobby Lobby would capitalize off of a war-torn country, right, especially one in which um America played a huge part in, is crazy. And what makes me sad though is that like through this, I like further down the rabbit hole, right? Like there's so many things that are lost to the ages, not because they're unattainable, but because people trade them, right? People steal them and people just use them as like a flex, right? Like the secret to life could be sitting in some skeevy art collector's house and we'll never know, right? Because what I was thinking, I was like, this is just like what we know that Hobby Lobby did, right? Like, what if there are more things that just went undetected? Like, what if this happened beyond what Customs was able to retrieve? Which, is crazy. And the timeline of the things that they had taken were from about 2500 BC to uh between 1900 to 1700 BC, and it included, like tablets with cuneiform writing, inscriptions about like their lives and like songs and, essentially just like what life used to be like. And as someone who didn't really used to care about history, who has recently realized that history is pretty freaking sick, this made me like this made me shrivel up inside because I'm like, man, we are just never gonna know anything. And so then I was thinking about how many things exist today that won't be known in the future because they're gonna be lost, not to any of this, right? Like not to looters, not to the nuclear war that is ever so impending doom upon us, right? Like we're gonna lose it all to the internet. And not just because like the internet isn't permanent, we're gonna drown it out by like screaming about things that don't matter. And that's where my headspace is, and that's where my mindset is. I just I don't know how to end this story. I just know that the fact that Hobby Lobby was caught smuggling, $3 million for their Bible museum is crazy. I don't know which part of that sentence is the more concerning one, but it also just kind of points to the fact that like most museums, right? Like just kind of it's an accepted fact, right? Like that most museums have stolen things from other places and other peoples. And I was reading a post from a photographer that I follow who I've mentioned on the show before. But he's from Egypt, and he was talking about like how he wants every Egyptian piece to be returned to Egypt, but at the same time, that means that, other people will not get to see such items. And it was making me think about this because as far as like Mexican culture goes, right? Like there are items that I have never seen, items that I probably never will see because they're scattered across the world. But at the same time, that means that other people get to see them and other people get to learn about them. And it's one of those like necessary evil types of situations where obviously like looting and stealing and thievery in general is bad, but I feel like it's not one of those things where it's like everyone return everything right now, right? It's like up until this point, this has been the practice. From this point forward, this should stop, right? And I can't believe that it's 2025 and that's still a thought and a conversation that's being had between, museum directors and historians alike. Because it's like the more that that conversation keeps going, the more that it keeps happening instead of being able to like openly and honestly, trade artifacts and have them on display from here to there and everywhere, right? It's like it already happened. You know what? The things that have already happened have happened. Museums make a deal. Museums, you know, strike an agreement between each other to rotate certain collections, I guess. But from this point forward, why is it such a crazy idea? Like, an insane idea. Because it's not just the Hobby Lobbies of the world just being weird and shady and using Christianity as a way to hide the fact that they're pieces of trash, right? Like, it's like big museums. It's all of the name brand, right? The luxury, the designer museums that we know and love that are also kind of in part complicit to this, right? Because of all of the collections that exist, I promise you every museum has at least one piece that came to be in a very problematic manner. But that's more of just an opinion train of thought. Like I said, I don't know exactly how I want to end that one, but this has been my hyperfixation for the last week, dude. Like I have not been able to think about anything else. Um, and like I was saying about ethical consumerism, right? Like for me, I'm someone who doesn't have fat stacks in their pocket. And so Michael's charging $1,001 for something that's worth $100 just so that you'll sign up for the rewards programs and for their coupon emails or whatever the hell. and who currently has an active lawsuit about the fact that they overcharge for items on purpose, right? Like, it's tough because I don't have the money to be giving it to someone that's so very obviously and unashamedly price gouging, right? But I can also make the choice that I don't want to give my money to Hobby Lobby. And it's not like, oh, I'm offended and you don't match my vibes and my views and my ideals. And it's like, none of that matters. I just don't want to give you my money. you know? You wouldn't give, if you wouldn't give your high school bully your lunch money, right? If you could give your money to somebody else. And that's kind of what it comes down to, right? And I feel like that's another, like, sort of like weird little train of thought that I was going down, because it's not just that, right? Like, it's shopping fast fashion instead of something that was homemade by your neighbor, right? Like, there are some things that people just simply can't or can't afford, and that's fine. But at the very least, I feel like it's not as crazy of a decision when it comes to like big stores and big corporations and stuff. Because, right now, Costco and Target and Walmart are all in the news for their own respective reasons. And of course, price point is a deciding factor, as well as um, social and political reasons, which, it's a decision that we make every day. But I think similarly to what I was talking about with the middle earlier, you just kind of have to choose what you can care about and when you can care about it, because otherwise, it's going to consume you forever. But as our time here draws to a close, I want to thank you all for hanging out with me and for listening to me go down a crazy train of thought. Um, you've been listening to Podcast with a K, and I'm your host, Carla with a K, signing off. I, of course, once again want to extend the thanks to anyone who hung out in the chat, anyone who listens to this afterwards on your preferred podcast listening platform, and to anyone that's listening to WECS 90.1 FM. I now return you to your regularly scheduled program, and I leave you with one last song, which is Nothing Compares to You, but not the version by Sinead O'Connor. I kind of wanted to show y'all the version by Miley, Cyrus, and Brittany Howard, which was featured on SNL 50 yesterday, because I honestly very rarely ever like the remixes or the reboots of any song, but this one I think did it justice. So here is that. Have a fantastic week, and we'll be back next week with new nonsense and new guests.